Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Restoring the Soul podcast. I'm Michael, and today in the studio on the podcast is Pastor Mark Batterson. Hi, Mark. Welcome.
Hey, Michael. Good to be with you.
I could read a long biography. We're going to put that in the show notes, but you're a pastor in Washington, D.C. at National Church. You are a multi New York Times bestselling author. And I know that you're just a great brother. When we were together at your church at the Connections Conference last November, Kurt Thompson had this crazy idea. We had never met each other, but we taught a mini class together. So wasn't that fun?
It really was. It was like improv theater, wasn't it?
It was. That's actually a really good description of it. And the part I appreciated about you was we got to pick on you a little bit because, Kurt wanted it to have that therapeutic feel to it. So, I just kept asking, well, how do you really feel kind of thing? So thanks for agreeing to be on the show. Your newest book came out in January, and I've got it right here. I'm going to hold it up. It's called Gradually, Then Suddenly, How to Dream Bigger, Decide Better, and Leave a Lasting Legacy. So let's just start at the beginning. There's a Hemingway quote, and one of the characters is asked, how did you go bankrupt? Well, two different ways, gradually, then suddenly. And as soon as I read that quote, I've heard it before, but I forgot the context of it. I thought, number one, that'll preach, right?
Yeah.
But then the other thing was, that sounds really powerful for everything that I've done and all of our listeners think about with transformation, that it doesn't happen overnight, that it's the long obedience in the same direction. So what was happening in you, in your heart and in your life that led you to take that idea and unpack it?
Yeah, Michael, I think we just celebrated our 30th anniversary pastoring National Community Church in D.C. And sometimes you hit inflection points where, this is the moment to write this book. That the first 5 years, nothing remarkable about it. It really was just planting and plowing. And we tend to overestimate what we can do in a year or two, underestimate what God can do in 10 or 20 or 30. And so this particular book, I just felt like, this is the moment. Let's mark this moment. And it really is amazing when I look at my life and really every dimension of it. Almost everything happens gradually, then suddenly. And so it just felt like this was the moment.
I know that this word can be overused in Christian circles, but it feels a little bit prophetic to me in the sense that our culture is absolutely enamored with the quick hit, the big program, sign up for the 6-week course. It will change your life. I mean, aren't you tired of hearing the word game changer or that phrase or, life changing? Did it really? So were you aware of that when you wrote the book, and was that part of the intention?
It really was. I'm drawn to long obedience in the same direction. The latest and greatest doesn't scratch the itch for me anymore, Michael. Show me someone who's been in the fight, whatever that is, for a lot of years, but maintain their integrity, and I might add humility and authenticity. And that's who I really want to hang out with. That little phrase, long obedience in the same direction, of course, is begged, borrowed, and stolen from Nietzsche. But then a guy named Eugene Peterson wrote a book by that title, I think in the 80s. It's not sexy. It really is. In fact, I would probably say it's sweaty. It's blood, sweat, and tears. And I think we've lost a little bit of that. We want things to happen at the speed of light, but they generally happen at the speed of a seed that has to take root before it can bear fruit. And so I understand emerging generations, like we kind of want twice what our parents had in half the time. But I think it's about playing the long game. And it really is just a reminder, hey, you got to have long vision, and it's about creating a long legacy, which I think is a little bit of a paradigm shift these days.
Yeah. You're in your mid 50s to late 50s. And I'm guessing that you wouldn't have been able to write this book when you were in your 30s or your 40s. Say a
No.
little bit about that, because you're nodding your head immediately going, nope, I couldn't.
Yeah. I wouldn't have written it even 10 years ago. Uh, I think there's something that you have to, almost like a fruit that has to ripen. You can't really rush it. There's some things that just they needed to stand the test of time. And so, yeah, I think, uh, wisdom is more like the crock pot, than the microwave. And I still have so much to learn. I'd be the first person to say I'm a data point of one. The more I know how much I don't know. But you lead something for 30 years, you pick up a lesson or two or three. And so many of those are embedded into the book. And, um, and I tip my cap. I've got a spiritual father who's 83. We hang out a lot. I've got mentors who are in their 80s. I just like people who have made a lot of trips around the sun, and I have a great deal of respect for those kind of people. And so uh, it's more battle tested and hard earned than just a trending hashtag, if you will.
Yeah, and you talked about the subtitle, How to Dream Bigger, Decide Better, and Leave a Lasting Legacy. Those first two parts about dreaming bigger and deciding better, and this is not a criticism, I think it's actually something that you held a balance that was really extraordinary in the writing itself, is that when people hear that dream bigger and decide better, it does feel like here's this recipe for self-improvement, but then you hear the phrase lasting legacy, and it's like, that's about the long term. And I am relatively new to your books. I've known of your books, but I didn't start reading your books until I met you. I had all of Dallas Willard's books on my shelf, and I couldn't read them. I couldn't get through them. And then I finally got to sit down with Dallas and have coffee and have a conversation, and then it just became easy. So, the first thing I want to say is that this book is actually a book with depth. There's a lot of books on the shelves that they're a mile wide and they're interesting and maybe even fun and fast paced, but they don't go very deep. And I don't think depth is in and of itself the point, but if you can communicate really important truths and to have that be deep so that people have to digest it, then that's really a home run. So you're obviously a great writer because you've sold, millions and millions of books, but I thought that this book, there was a surprising amount of depth to it that I thought, and I think can only be written from the vantage point of a man who has lived life well, who has had some suffering in his life, who has made some mistakes and had some success, but it came from a deep place inside of you. So thank you for all that. I told you before the interview that I did not finish the book yet because I can, in about 15 minutes or 20 minutes, I can spend with a book and say that I've read it and pretty much say back everything inside of it. And your book is worthy of a lot more attention than that.
Well, that's very kind. And as someone who really likes to eat ice cream slow and savor it and enjoy it, I take that as a tremendous compliment. Um, and, Michael, I think life is too short not to keep it real. I mean, our first attempt at church planning was a failed attempt, and it was so embarrassing. But it's one of the best things that ever happened to us. The cure for the fear of failure is not success. It's failure in small enough doses that you build up an immunity to it. And so I'm grateful for that failed church plant. And then I felt called to write at 22, but I didn't write a book until 35. And it was like this dream deferred that I actually started to despise my birthday because it felt like an annual reminder of a dream deferred. But looking back on it, I'm grateful because if I had written a book at 22, I would have had to write a book at 23 to retract what I said at 22. So I'm a guy that not even a naturally gifted writer. In fact, took the GRE at 22 and it showed a low aptitude for writing. So I read 3,000 books before writing one. And so it's kind of the old school approach that no one gets a 20% discount on the 10,000 hour rule. You have to pay your dues, no shortcuts, no cheat codes. And that's why I'm a big believer, like, enjoy the journey. The goal of accomplishing a dream isn't just accomplishing a dream. It's who you become in the process. And so a lot of that is woven in. And then I think all truth is God's truth. Everyology is a branch of theology. So I really try to weave some of that in. And, but I appreciate those kind words. I think, the best books are ones that you read slowly. And then you enjoy them so much when you get to the end notes, you actually follow those rabbit trails. At least that's how I read. And, so I'm glad you haven't finished the book quite yet.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to keep going, and I'm going to recommend it to others. So when you've gone through seasons of your own life where it's the gradual and the suddenly isn't coming, what was God, like in the most recent instance of that, what was God forming in you? Because again, you're very, very successful by all measures. And yet I also know that you don't become the kind of person that I've experienced you to be without just ongoing gradual and not a lot of suddenly. So in those seasons, what is it that you've learned in particular that came out in the book? But I'd like to hear kind of from even though it's one of the many stories in the book, just referring to your own journey.
Yeah. Well, one of our core values as a church, something that kind of comes out of my life, is if you stay humble and stay hungry, there's nothing God can't do in you or through you. And so you can actually do the will of God and God can oppose it because he opposes the proud. So I've always felt like don't worry about the outcomes. And this is hard because I'm a 3 on the Enneagram, so I tend to be kind of a performer, achiever, always thinking about what's next. But I've really had to learn just what Michael Jordan would call the love of the game. Like you gotta, in fact, it's interesting when John Wooden, the famous coach, retired, he was asked what he missed most. And it wasn't the championships. He said practice. And so I think it's the intrinsic motivation of, Michael, I love God's word. Now, I love teaching it. That's the end product. But man, I love reading it, studying it. I love the spiritual disciplines. I wrote a book on prayer, and the Lord has answered some pretty remarkable prayers. But you know what? I enjoy talking to my Heavenly Father. So I think what I've tried to do is really focus on my own personal spiritual growth. And, long before God grows a church or grows a counseling practice or grows a business, I think he wants to grow a leader. Leadership starts with self-leadership. So this is me kind of unpacking some of the behind the scenes. And, before a book was even published, I had been writing for years and years and years. So it's more about enjoying the actual process of the things that God has called me to. And then you leave the results to God.
Yeah, you tell so many wonderful stories just as far as along as I am, and I've skimmed through the end, but about how some of that success came forward. Will you tell the story of how you and probably your wife and a group of people said that you wanted to give a certain percentage of the income from your book and what happened then?
Yeah. And it's always hard to share really personal stuff. Finances is such a personal thing, but before I wrote my 6th book, which was really the breakout book, The Circle Maker, almost as a grand gesture. I felt like the Lord was going to bless it and bless it beyond what we would want to take as income. And so we actually created a foundation and said, Lord, let's go 50-50 on this one and see what you do. And so one of our goals is to reverse tithe someday, to live off of 10%, give 90%. And that takes a lot of financial stewardship, but also just the Lord's blessing. But Michael, I think the heart behind that is that joy is found on the giving side of life. That it can't just be about accumulating. In fact, I would go way back to when we set some life goals. And at first, just to be honest, we had set some getting goals. And then the Lord really convicted me and said, why don't we flip this and set giving goals? And that changed our mindset. And so one of the great joys is not just any kind of income that books would produce. That's fleeting, and we don't get to take any of that with us anyways. Do your giving while you're living. And so it really has been fun over the years to not only write books that impact people's lives, but then to take the income that generates and give it to the kingdom causes that we care about. And so that may be Prison Fellowship. My wife serves on the board of that wonderful organization. It may be the church that we have the joy of leading, but we really enjoy and find great joy in playing what I would call the giving game. And in my experience, you can't outgive God. And it's not just about dollars and cents. I'm just so grateful for joy unspeakable, for peace that passes understanding. I want to make sure that I'm investing my time, talent, treasure in anything that's near and dear to the heart of God. And God has a way of honoring that.
You talk about legacy, and I mentioned that that's in the subtitle. And with that, you link this idea of cathedral thinking. Will you unpack what that is? I love that idea.
Well, I think it's the Cologne Cathedral that, man, took about 500 years to build, give or take. And we don't think that way anymore. I mean, we think we're long-term thinking if we have a 3-year plan. I think cathedral thinking is this idea of doing what we do for the third and fourth generation. And so just as we drink from wells we didn't dig, are we digging wells for the next generation? So as an example, Michael, we own a city block in D.C. It's where we met for the first time, and we're a part of that conference together. We have an acre and a half of roof deck, but it's a building that's 134 years old. We dug 109 micropiles 40 feet deep to reinforce the original footers of the building so we could unlock the roof deck. Now, here's the catch. We don't have any plans on building on top of this building, but the next generation might. And so we felt like if we're going to play the long game, let's set up future generations to stand on our shoulders. And I think that is cathedral thinking. It's thinking not just in terms of my lifetime, but even as a new grandfather, thinking about future generations and how we can set them up. So long story short, legacy is not what we accomplish. Legacy is what others accomplish because of us.
Oh, I love that. Say that again. And by the way, for anybody listening, and this is your first time to hearing Mark Batterson, this is what you do. You have these one-liners that are not cheesy things. They're like, they make you stop and want to write it down and say that again about legacy. Go ahead and say that again.
Well, legacy is not what we accomplish. Legacy is what others accomplish because of us. And that's my way of also tipping my cap to generations that have gone before us. And that would be family members, but also, I have an 83-year-old spiritual father named Dick Foth. And Michael, I know I wouldn't be who I am or where I am without borrowing his wisdom. And during critical moments, even with decisions that we've made over the years. I'm so grateful for the collective wisdom of previous generations. It was Edgar Allan Poe who wrote that little poem, is all that we see or seem but a dream within a dream. And so I really view it as whatever God's doing in and through me is really a dream within a dream. Tip of my cap to my mom and dad, but also my father-in-law and mother-in-law who planted and pastored a church for 31 years. And so anything God does through this church is really a tip of the cap to what God did in and through them planting a church way back in 1967. So I want to be someone who is careful to give honor where honor is due.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
What if healing didn't have to take years? Hey friends, it's Michael. At Restoring the Soul, we guide men, women, and couples through intensive counseling that brings deep transformation, often in just a few weeks. And our mission is fueled by generous people like you. Now you can become a monthly partner by setting up a recurring donation of any amount. If you give $20 or more on a monthly basis, I'll send you a signed copy of my book, Sacred Attachment. To set up a monthly gift, visit restoringthesoul.com and click Donate. Make sure in the notes section to type the word book. Thanks for helping to restore lives. What would you say as a pastor to the person who is, they feel like they've not had a suddenly? They're trying to be faithful. They're living that long obedience in the same direction, and the dream never happens, or along the way, their dream is shattered.
Well, I think one of the things that I would say up front is, very few people will influence thousands or millions of people. Very few people. But we may influence one person who influences far more. And so I would say to every mom and dad out there, man, the influence you have on your kids is incalculable. So, Michael, some people feel like they're not living their dream, but what they don't realize is they're actually having a profound influence on the next generation. So let's not be too quick to keep score on this side of eternity. I think I had a grandfather that passed away when I was 6 years old, but his legacy lives on in me. There have been moments in my life where the Holy Spirit has said, Mark, the prayers of your grandfather are being answered in your life right now. In fact, I bet anybody listening, you can think about blessings that you did nothing to deserve. And my hunch is in eternity, God will connect some of those dots, because we tend to think right here, right now. God is thinking nations and generations. And so just an encouragement that I bet you're making more of a difference than what you think. And maybe even the dream isn't really God's ultimate plan for your life. I'm not saying give up on it. I'm not saying walk away from it. But in my experience, you have to kind of white knuckle. You need long vision, but you also just need to be faithful day in and day out. And if we're faithful with the little things, in fact, let me say it this way. If we do little things like they're big things, God has a way of doing big things like they're little things. So stay focused on the little things.
Mm. Yeah, I appreciate you saying that our dream might not be God's ultimate thing for us. And I think there's also this danger in the social media world that we live with the shoulds, that this is what my life should look like. I should have this perfect life, or I should have this perfect ministry. And that's just not often the case. So you talk about convictions versus just cultural trends and the shifting winds, and you talk about decisions. Those are both kind of common words that, convictions, decisions, those are important, but how you unpack that is really rich. I love your humor, by the way, and the stories. So Talk a little bit about the importance of convictions and decisions and how that plays into this long game.
Yeah. Uh, Crawford Loritz, I quote him in the book. He said something that we were just at a dinner together and he dropped this gold on us. He said, when you're born, you look like your parents. When you die, you look like your decisions, which I just think is such a fun, playful way almost of thinking about it. And so I think the most important decisions that we're ever going to make are pre-decisions. They're the decision we make before we have to make the decision. And so in a sense, you only make a few major decisions. You spend the rest of your life managing those decisions. So destiny is not a mystery. Destiny is a decision. And the good news is you're probably one decision away from a totally different life. You just need the courage to make that decision. So, I think hopefully the book helps people kind of process and challenge, hey, what are some hard decisions that maybe, just maybe, I need to make? And then the convictions, Michael, I'm really tempted to flip the script here and say, what are your core convictions? What gets you up early in the morning? What keeps you up late at night? But I think in a world where we just cancel so quickly and there's so much shaming and blaming and even faming, I think you better not lead by peer pressure, popular opinion, or political correctness. You've got to know that you have convictions that this is how I'm going to lead. And I sure hope that those convictions are biblically informed. And so, I think being a person of conviction is all too rare these days.
Yeah, so along those lines, I'm sure this had a lot to do with your leadership and your vision, but how did your church arrive at a place of a conviction where you would go to such length of putting in those pillars to be able to build up the roof just for the purpose of legacy? How did legacy become a conviction? Because I don't hear that ever in leadership structures.
I think it was modeled. Like I just had mentors that really invested in my life. And I'm like, okay, we need to return this favor. So part of it is a mindset that I think every pastor is an interim pastor. And so I want to make sure that whatever we're doing is kind of setting up others. And so we often say we're not trying to build a church, we're trying to bless a city to the third and fourth generation. And so, Michael, one of the things I talk about in the book was a really hard decision that, 5 years ago, we were a multi-site church with 8 campuses, and I felt like the Lord said, do more things that don't have your name on it. And we started launching campuses, and that means waving goodbye to a lot of amazing people and amazing people who gave to this church. So I'm not blowing smoke here. I really felt like we've got to set up the next generation of pastors. So what we've done is almost turned ourselves inside out and really tried to help the next generation launch churches. And so it just comes from a deep place of conviction. There's that word again. And now you don't want to do that unless you really heard from the Lord, but we really felt like we did. And so we think part of playing the long game is just doing more things that don't have our name on it.
It feels entirely counterintuitive to do those kinds of things, where instead of putting your name on it more and to become bigger, so you have a hat that says Ebenezer's Coffee House. And I think that that's one of the spin-offs of what you do. And there's other, just talk about a few of the spin-offs that are there, including the miracle of the block that you inhabit and how that was this historic site where the streetcars used to turn around well over 100 years ago, and how that became your church because of this kind of creative thinking. So in other words,
Yeah.
the gradually over all these years had some suddenlies where these outposts of the kingdom are now all throughout Washington, D.C.
Yeah. Well, Michael, we have to go back to 1996, a Sunday where we had 13 people. And that week I felt this prompting, reading Joshua 1:3, I'll give you everywhere you set your foot. And I just felt this prompting to pray a perimeter around Capitol Hill. It turned into a 4.7-mile prayer walk. And I wasn't praying for property, I was just praying for people. Lord, let your kingdom come. Let your will be done in D.C. as it is in heaven. And 30 years later, we own 7 properties on that prayer circle. I mean, it's almost hard to hear me say it, but worth $100 million. And we never thought we would own property. And so one of them is the crack house that we turned into Ebenezer's Coffee House. And I think God has blessed it, but because we said we're going to give every penny of profit to kingdom causes. And then that other property is that city block that we have turned into the Capitol turnaround. Not only do we use it for our weekend worship, for our house of prayer on Thursday nights, but we host about 150 events, including the conference where you and I met. And it really has become a place where church and community cross paths, which is part of our, I think, philosophy of ministry, that Jesus didn't just hang out in the synagogue. He hung out at wells. Wells were natural gathering places in ancient culture. So what we've tried to do is maybe a little unorthodox, but those properties include a coffee house, what has become an event venue. We own the Miracle Theater. We have our DC Dream Center. And one of the things we try to do at those properties is also just be a blessing to others. We incubate other church plants in those buildings. And then a church that stays within its 4 walls isn't a church at all. So what it allows us to do is really be salt and light right here on Capitol Hill.
Thank you for just expanding upon all of that. I really am drawn when I was there to the way that the church does ministry, and there's a very open-handedness with it, as opposed to having a really tight agenda that this is how it's going to be. Hey, your time is really valuable, and it's later in the day there on the East Coast, but would you end with this? The part where I am in the book, where I've camped out, is you live in Capitol Hill, Washington, D.C., and you told the story about how General President George Washington commissioned an architect and a designer to envision something. And the line that you used, I believe, is that everything's created twice. So I can't pronounce nor remember that architect designer's name, but tell that story.
Yeah, Pierre Charles L'Enfant. And those who live in D.C., it's one of the metro stops, L'Enfant station. So, everything is created twice. The first creation is usually in the imagination, which is part of the Imago Dei. And for L'Enfant, it was looking at swampland and then kind of superimposing this mental map. And so, Michael, it's funny, whether I'm running the National Mall or driving around the city or some of the circles that we have, I'm often cognizant that, hey, where I am first existed in the imagination of a French architect commissioned by George Washington. And that to me is pretty cool because you and I were first conceived in the imagination of God. We are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus to do good works prepared for us in advance. And so when we exercise our imagination, we really are doing exactly what the Creator did in the beginning. And so just an encouragement that it takes blood, sweat, and years for that second creation. But the first creation, who knows what God wants to do in each one of us. I'd rather have one God idea than 1,000 good ideas. But then the catch is you've got to take every thought captive, 2 Corinthians 10:5, and make it obedient to Christ. And so that's where gradually turns into suddenly.
Great ending. Thank you for landing the plane in that place. I really appreciate your time to talk about the book and just for listeners to get to know you. Thanks for writing the book. I'm really looking forward to digging in and letting it marinate and marinating in it. I love your writing style and just all that you have to say, Mark.
Hey, Michael, thank you so much. Joy and privilege, and look forward to the next time that our paths cross.
Yeah, me too. Good to see you again. Take care.
God bless.
So we've wrapped up another episode of Restoring the Soul. We want you to know that Restoring the Soul is so much more than a podcast. In fact, the heart of what we have done for nearly 20 years is intensive counseling. When you can't wait months or years to get out of the rut you're in, our intensive counseling programs in Colorado allow you to experience deep change in half-day blocks over 2 weeks. To learn more, visit restoringthesoul.com. That's restoringthesoul.com.